War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 37, the Arab-Israeli conflict from 1939 until 1948. This title is almost a misnomer, as from 1939 on, there was little direct conflict between the Jews and Arabs in Palestine that did not directly involve the British. During most of World War II, the Jews abandoned their pressure on the British, rationalizing that the Nazis posed a greater threat than Great Britain. In the words of David Ben-Gurion, still leading the Jewish community in Palestine, known collectively as the Yishuv, support the British as if there were no white paper, and oppose the white paper as if there is no war. Approximately 8% of the total Jewish population ended up serving in the British Army. Conversely, the Grand Mufti, a title bestowed on Amin al-Husseini by the British, moved to German-occupied Europe and openly allied with Hitler. While some Palestinian Arabs served with the British, more ended up serving in the various Muslim divisions of the Nazi SS. This podcast will focus on the various Jewish groups fighting in Palestine, to various degrees, the British. In 1939, there were two primary groups: the Haganah, translated to the Defense, by far the largest and effectively commanded by David Ben-Gurion, under the auspices of the Jewish Agency, which was the mainstream secular socialist movement of Zionism. The second main group was the Irgun, which had split off from the Haganah in 1931, and more committed to the Jewish nationalist vision of Jabotinsky. The Irgun had proven to be more offensive during the Arab Revolt, and often led reprisal raids against Arab communities after attacks on Jews. Both Haganah and Irgun supported the British in World War II, but as the atrocities against Jews increased, and the British refused to increase any immigration, a group split off from the Irgun and formed Lehi, an acronym for the Hebrew translation from Fighters for the Freedom of Israel. Lehi felt that the British were the greater enemy of the Jews than Hitler, whom, they believed, wanted all Jews out of Europe, but with the British, they had no place to go. Lehi, founded by Avraham Stern and sometimes called the Stern Gang, was a terrorist group. This split in 1940 also saw the death of Jabotinsky by heart attack while visiting a Jewish defense training center in New York. David Ben-Gurion refused to allow Jabotinsky to be buried in Palestine, and it wasn't until 1964, when Ben-Gurion was no longer prime minister, that his remains were buried in Jerusalem. Stern was a leading member of the Irgun and was instrumental in its founding. Lehi did little initially, trying, unsuccessfully, and somewhat embarrassingly, to ally with first Italy and later Germany. Lehi's proposal to raise an army to remove Britain from Palestine with Nazi help received no reply. Lehi never had more than a few hundred members. This limited them to assassinations and bombings, such as the British minister Lord Moyne in Cairo. Lehi, unlike the Irgun and Haganah, also did not limit its attacks to British targets in Palestine. They attacked throughout Europe. The Irgun was a revolutionary organization, but not explicitly a terrorist organization. The recruitment process was exceedingly difficult and quite long, several months in fact. Many came from the Haganah. The Irgun led the charge prior to World War II to bring Jews illegally to Palestine, an activity the Haganah refused to partake in. Irgun cells were established throughout Europe and even in Asia to facilitate the evacuation of Jews. The Haganah and Irgun's cooperation with the British started to come to an end even before the conclusion of World War II. By 1944, when it was clear Hitler was going to lose, both the Jews and Great Britain started thinking of the diplomatic end state in Palestine. The Irgun abandoned its cooperation with Great Britain, but the Haganah allied with Great Britain to hunt down Irgun members and imprison them or hand them over to British authorities in what was known as the hunting season. Ben-Gurion's demand for total control led to many political enemies who had no connection with the Irgun or Lehi to be arrested simply under his orders. Many giants of future Israeli politics were on both sides of the struggle, notably future Prime Ministers Menachem Begin and Yigal Allon, Jerusalem Mayor Teddy Kollek, who served in this role for over 30 years, and IDF commanders Moshe Dayan and Yisraeli Galili. Menachem Begin was the only one who was part of the Irgun. The Haganah's crackdown, or betrayal, depending on your viewpoint, ended in early 1945, and was very successful in stopping the Irgun's attack on the British. Ironically, only a few months later, the Irgun, Lehi, and Haganah would join forces as part of the Jewish resistance movement. The Arabs of Palestine at this point were highly disjointed. Amin al-Husseini, due to his allegiance with Hitler, was persona non grata in Palestine and went first to France after being denied refuge in Switzerland. The French welcomed him, hoping he would improve relations with the local Arabs in their territory. The British demanded his extradition as a British citizen and Nazi collaborator, which the French refused. Yugoslavia wanted him as well, as his forces slaughtered thousands of Serb civilians fighting with the Bosnian Muslims. Greece as well held him responsible for several thousand executions of Greek Orthodox Christians during the war. As the pressure built, the French decided to let him go to Egypt, where the newly independent government there granted him asylum. Although unable to live in Palestine, Amin al-Husseini attempted to unite the Arabs from afar to mixed results. The ultimate point was, as much as the Jews were disjointed into different factions, the Arabs of Palestine had no leadership on the ground. As the British post-World War II were squarely pro-Arab, this presented little difficulty, and the Arabs and British cooperated against their common Zionist antagonists. But this lack of unity would come back to haunt them. Immediately before the end of World War II, Churchill's conservative government was defeated by the Labour Party. Churchill was personally a staunch Zionist, and the incoming Labour Party had expressed explicit support for Zionism and a Jewish homeland. These assurances were part of the calculus for the Haganah's support of the British over their fellow Jews. But the Labour Foreign Secretary, Bevin, was not a Zionist, and in fact was in every way pro-Arab. This trend of a population being pro-Israel but the diplomatic corps not so much makes sense. As diplomats, they are more concerned with the opinion of people outside their own nation. The U.S. State Department has often taken a far more pro-Arab position than domestic politics would indicate. There are a lot of Muslims and Islamic countries, and only one Jewish nation. But, as Bevin's antagonistic position became clear, and Labour's promises of support to Zionism rapidly dissipated, the unity of the Jewish population was shown in the creation of the United Resistance Movement, or Jewish Resistance Movement, in October of 1945. And here, attacks on British police stations, raids on internment camps to free Jewish prisoners, the bombing of bridges, railways, and train stations all occurred. Most notably was the bombing of the King David Hotel. This bombing was a reaction to Operation Agatha. Here the British, with 20,000 troops, arrested thousands of Jews and seized documents belonging to the Jewish Agency, the unofficial Jewish government in Palestine. The violence of the Jewish resistance movement led the British to fear a coup and overthrow. The Jews also held 2 British officers prisoner as collateral against several Irgun members sentenced to death. The documents taken from the Jewish Agency were moved to the King David Hotel, which served as the administrative headquarters for the British, commingling with the civilian part of the hotel. Included were the military headquarters, military communications center, and the investigative wing of the Palestine police. Destroying the documents was the primary objective. The Irgun, who led the bombing, claimed warning was given 25 minutes before the bomb detonated, which was ignored. The British denied having received the warning. Regardless, the building was not evacuated, and 91 people, of whom 5 were bystanders, the rest part of the British headquarters as officials, clerks, workers, police, and soldiers. The British were aghast, and David Ben-Gurion was all too happy to throw Irgun under the bus, which broke apart the unified resistance movement the next month. Chaim Weizmann, president of the World Zionist Organization, asked for all military action to be stopped, which Lehi and Irgun refused to do. The British responded with Operation Shark, which cordoned and searched all of Tel Aviv, and every man and woman personally searched and screened. 780 were arrested. Almost the entire leadership of Lehi and Irgun were arrested, probably with no small amount of help from the Haganah. Future Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, part of Lehi, was interned in Africa. The British then gave an order to boycott all Jewish stores and to have no contact with Jews at all. The order given in such a manner to show no real benefit other than overt anti-Semitism, which was common among the British officers. Needless to say, the attacks continued against British targets. The tactics were ambushes, bombings, booby traps, targeting of trains, police, and soldiers. British and Arab civilians were not directly targeted, but inevitably some were killed during the operations, along with Jews. It is hard to see the British end state they hoped for. The Arabs were allies only so long as the British promised independence. The Jews, after the Holocaust, saw themselves without options. They would fight to the death. Britain's economy was in shambles post-war, and their socialist government was not helping things. The entire mood was anti-colonial, with Kenya, Egypt, and India all moving away from British rule. It is hard to not see a certain pride, that great sin warned of by Sun Tzu, forcing Britain's hand. Winston Churchill, leader of the opposition and a staunch believer in the British Empire, was openly calling for abandonment of Palestine to the UN. Palestine was descending into chaos. The Jews saw this as a war against the colonial power. The British saw the various militias as nothing more than criminal gangs. Captured Jews were sentenced to prison, and in some cases, floggings. The Jews responded by threatening to flog any British police or soldier they found. The British were incessantly conducting searching cordons of Jewish villages and towns, which did nothing to stop the violence, but everything to anger local Jewish populations, who began to see little difference between the British in Palestine and the Gestapo. The fact that this was occurring less than 2 years after the end of World War II cannot be forgotten. And the British were keeping nearly 100,000 Jews in effectively concentration camps, with more than half on Cyprus alone. Ships of Jews were being forced to sail back to Germany, as the strict controls on Jewish immigration remained in place. By February 1947, the British were beginning to crack. They ordered all non-essential British personnel to evacuate, and, after another series of attacks on British police and military, imposed martial law on 1 March. Jews were placed under mass house arrest, with curfews for all but a few hours a day. Criminal courts were closed, and only military courts functioned. All driving by Jews was banned, and British forces authorized to shoot on sight anyone violating the curfew, which they did. And the attacks only increased. And within 2 weeks, the British were forced to lift their draconian restrictions. And yet again, the attacks increased. The British were now reduced to collective punishment, expelling Jews from their homes due only to proximity to attacks. The death penalty was now being handed out regularly as punishment to capture Irgun and Lehi members. Again, Haganah members were spared, which indicates the quiet coordination being done by the Jewish Agency with the British. Ben-Gurion's organization was quite happy with the pressure being applied by Irgun and Lehi against the British, and likewise was quite satisfied with the British removing his internal political opponents. The tactics, again, were sabotage of railways, bombings, landmines, shooting attacks, and destruction of oil infrastructure in Haifa, one of the few sources of real revenue for the British. In May of 1947, the Irgun attacked Acre Prison, freeing dozens of Jewish prisoners, along with 214 Arabs. While no British were killed, 4 Irgun died along with 5 escapees. 5 more Irgun were captured, and as 3 of them were under 18, the other 2 sentenced to death. In July, the Irgun captured 2 British soldiers, holding them hostage for the release of the 5 captured Irgun. Instead, the British executed the Irgun members, and likewise, the Irgun hanged the 2 captured British. The British forces rampaged through Tel Aviv, killing 5 Jewish civilians and wounding over a dozen more. Mayors of most Jewish cities were arrested and held without trial. The British Army began destroying Jewish houses. But this final frenzy of violence showed the hollowness of the British position. No one wanted them in Palestine. Not the Jews, not the Arabs, and now, least of all, the British people. By September, the British ordered the evacuation of Palestine. The British government punted the whole mess to the UN, who, in November of 1947, published their recommendation of partition. While the Irgun and Lehi continued their attacks on the British, the bulk of the fighting transitioned to Arab against Jew, as both sides maneuvered for advantage, with the impending British evacuation only months away. While the British handed the matter to the UN, that did not mean they cooperated. In fact, they actively thwarted all attempts by the UN to implement the partition on the grounds it disadvantaged the Arabs. British policy had devolved to ensuring the Arabs didn't blame them for what was happening. As they abandoned military positions and government offices, the British handed these over to Arabs only. Likewise, all Jewish agency funds were frozen in British banks. In May of 1948, the British mandate officially ended, with approximately 400 deaths on all sides. The State of Israel was declared, and war, this time, directly between Jews and Arabs, had begun. A war we will discuss next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments. and hope you join us again next week. See you then.